Hey, Katrina.
Hiya.
How you going?
Yeah, good.
Good.
I think so. I've kept those slides in mind because I don't think they've been moved anywhere else, just the definitions. But I don't think it matters, you know. I just think I think saying the same thing over and over again is fine, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can always move through it as quickly as you need to.
Yeah,
Sure.
exactly. That's right. Exactly. I'll just see how, what comes before and what I do need to say. How's the singing going?
My voice is back. So
Yeah,
next week I'll be back for the first one. I
excellent.
skipped a few days ago just because I was like right on the edge. I was just doing too many things and not being kind
Getting
to my
run down,
body.
right? I know,
Yeah.
getting run down, right? It's that time of year as well. It's hard to, I always find this the hardest time of year to be nice to myself because I'm tired.
Yeah. And just I don't
Ready
know.
for Christmas.
It's always so beautiful here. It's hard not to do things. Hi, Melissa.
You should move to Tasmania.
Yeah, I need some shittier weather.
It's
Hi,
it
Albert.
snowed here last. Hey,
Yeah.
Albert and Melissa. It snowed here last night.
Yeah, right. Well, no, it's gonna be like 28 degrees on the weekend here.
Well, I think we're going to have a high. So yesterday it was a high of 8, and it said feels like 3.7.
Yeah, so that's what I need. I can
That's
just
what you
sit by a
need.
fire.
You just won't go
Yeah,
out, right? You sit and watch shit TV like I do.
yeah.
Albert,
How
how's
you
it
all
going,
there?
Melissa?
You're both muted.
Am I muted?
No,
No.
Katrina,
No,
you're
just me. I've been having a one-way conversation for a while over here.
best kind of conversations. No one interrupts you. Yeah.
It's good. I commented that I have the same problem as you, Erin, in San Diego. The weather's been lovely for a long time. No complaints.
You don't even talk about the weather in California, right? Because it's always nice.
No.
I mean, no one says, "Hey."
I mean, unless
about the
there's like a
weather?
little bit of rain, and then nobody will shut up about it because it's a
that's
wellness
so
thing
funny.
to discuss. It's so unusual. Yeah. San Diegans have funny attitudes towards rain. It's sort of
I
like
know.
just don't go to work if it's raining because that's really ridiculous.
And being from Britain, of course, we talk about the weather all the time. So I remember going to, California, and I was like, "So, what do you think of the weather today?" They're like, "Oh, it's kind of like the same as it's been all year." Like, oh, we all wanted to talk about it.
Oh yeah, that sounds about right.
You need new holding topics.
What's that?
You just need new holding topics, and it's like, how's your
I'm all right
Are you
here.
looking forward to Christmas? How was Christmas? Yeah.
I am looking forward. Actually, yes, I am looking forward to Christmas. Now you mention it, thank goodness, right? I'm going on holiday in 4 weeks. I'm so excited.
Oh, that's good.
A good one.
4 weeks going to New Zealand for 5 weeks. New Zealand.
Beautiful.
Doing nothing.
Do you want to actually, just test that you can all share your presentations?
Yeah.
I do have backup online that I can like click through for you, but obviously it's nicer if you can do it on your own. Whoever's first can just click share screen.
I just did mine. And then how do I make it big?
Top right corner. Little maximize maybe.
Where? I don't see anything.
It's full screen now.
Do I just go onto full screen in? How's that? But now I can't see my presentation. All right.
Before it was already full screen, I think.
Yeah.
How do I go full? Is that?
And there's full screen for you, and there's also full screen for us, which I think we control on different ends.
So can you see it full screen?
Mostly. Yeah, there's like our little faces, but I think that's fine.
How do I go to full screen? Stop sharing. All right, does someone else? Oh, sorry, I don't use this ever. I always use Zoom.
We just got an email from Kevin. He needs the link to our meeting. Oh, I got it. I found it. I can send it to
Okay,
you.
but he should also. He should be in as like a main person.
Hopefully the link that I used to join, if I send that to him, it will work.
What's that look
Yeah.
like now?
Kind of the same. But do you want to just 'cause it honestly looks fine from my end.
Does it?
I would,
For me as
yeah.
well. Yeah.
It looks okay. All right.
Yeah. Then Melissa or Albert, do you want to try yours?
Yes.
What did you? It's not full screen, is it?
No, you've got your slide showing.
Now should be fine, yeah.
Yep.
Nice,
Looks good.
nice slides, by the way, Albert.
Well,
They're really nice.
Okay.
And Melissa.
Yes. Okay.
All the pretty Kelp photos. Everyone's got them.
I don't think I've got any Kelp
That's
photos on mine.
important.
Don't have any Kelp photos.
I should have done.
How does that look? Can you
Kinda
see that?
forgot.
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay.
All right, so Kevin's joined, but he's not.
Oh shoot.
Uh,
Okay.
Let's see if I can fix this. Make a presenter. Okay. Kevin, can you hear us?
He's
Camera.
muted.
There's my mic.
There he is.
Okay, you guys got me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Sound good? Audio good?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. And let me test
Um,
my slides.
Yeah, just do a quick slide check. If Melissa, you can exit yours.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, and am I sharing now? Let's see, share.
No.
Hang on a second. Let's get a different
I
window.
can just do
Can you
mine
see
real
me?
quick. Yeah, I see you. Do you see
Okay,
the holding slide?
I can't see my face. So as long as you can see my face, that's fine. My screen is black on my viewer.
Yeah, I think it just auto arranges depending on real estate. Do you
Okay.
see the holding slide? Just from my end.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. That's me. Good. Kevin, can you check yours?
Yep. Share.
And your camera's also off, by the way, if you're hoping to have that on.
Is it?
Yeah.
And I can, if I do a PowerPoint, actually, I can do a PowerPoint share and see how it works.
Really weird that I can't see my own face. It's I have the screen, it's just black, like it's gray.
You look fantastic, don't worry.
Yeah.
it's fine.
There's-
It's just,
There's no like streak across your face or anything you can't
okay,
notice.
okay. No worries.
Okay, how's it? Are you able to see my screen or?
Yeah,
Yep.
we see the slides and you're back on camera.
Okay, cool. Great.
So we'll probably give it a few minutes. And there's 30 people. There are 350 people who registered.
Holy cow. Good
which is-
work.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
Some advertising has been effective.
Wow, good work.
But that
That's
said,
amazing.
we're now currently batting at what, 10% that are in the lobby. So
Oh, they'll turn up.
yeah, 35. Anything.
Yeah, they'll everyone comes in right on time with these things, or late.
Yeah, so we'll just give them a minute, and then I'll give you all just a raise hand at your kind of 12-minute mark. Or sorry, your 10-minute mark, and try to wrap up by
10.
the 12.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to be
And
speedy.
if you go past into your question time, then there's
That's
the
all right. I've
dedicated
got
question time at the end. So it's not the end of the world, but always nice.
It's all good.
What's the
So
total
that'll
time
just
of this? What's our total time that we're gonna have run? Hour and a half?
an hour and a
Mhm.
half plus bonus if we want to
Okay.
keep the conversation. So just for your reference, that's what the hand looks like for your 10 minutes.
Hmm.
I think that's mostly it. Yeah, you've all given presentations before.
Great. Be ocean positive today, shall we?
Okay. Trickling on in. You awake, Albert?
100%. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I'm a bit sleepy.
What time is it there?
It looks so
Like
bright.
6:30.
Yeah.
6:30.
I'm facing an eastern window, I guess. So the sun just came out.
Where are you located, Albert?
First in the west coast of Finland,
Got it.
where no one goes.
Unless they need minerals.
Yeah, really. It is a nice city, though. It's a beautiful place.
Yeah, it's a nice
It's,
place. I
it's,
mean,
it's just so far. I mean, Tasmania's remote as well, but I think WA is more remote, right?
yeah.
I think
Also, it's
Perth
insanely
is like the second most isolated major city in the world after Honolulu.
What is? Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
That's-
Huh.
So
There you have it.
that's fun, I guess.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Shall we get kicking?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. 2 minutes in. So we have to admit everybody. So if I fall behind on admitting, if you see new people, just let them in.
We got
Makes
87 now.
Yeah. Oh, 80, 88.
89.
Right, so yeah, just admit people as you see them.
Sounds
Otherwise.
good.
The flooding. Flood through. Well, hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everyone joining us just as we admit the late entrance from the waiting room. But thank you so much for coming to our webinar on kelp forest, carbon sequestration, project finance, what we know, and what's next for the field. The webinar is being presented by the Kelp Forest Alliance and Sea Trees and Sustainable Surf. And I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Gadigal people from where I'm presenting today in Sydney, Australia, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So today we're going to talk about kelp forest carbon and this really sort of important issue that if you Google kelp forests, aside from the what do they taste like and can I eat them question, carbon kind of comes up as this second most hanging point on everyone's mind. And there's been a lot of information put out there about their potential role in sequestration, carbon credits, carbon finance, and all these sorts of things. And a lot of information gets put forward, and we just thought it'd be really useful to try to bring together some of the leading experts in the field and just go over what we know, what we don't know, how we fill those gaps, and really where we want to go from here. So hopefully you'll enjoy hearing from our host of panelists. First, we have Kevin Wilden talking about why this is all needed. Then we have Albert Dona talking about kelp forests, their ecology, and the basic sort of carbon cycling element side of things. Then Katrina Hurd looking at how we actually measure that carbon exchange and if it were to be used in a carbon credit. And Melissa Ward will talk about, all right, if you do have that sort of carbon measured, how do you actually turn that into a kelp carbon credit and what's needed from the market side of things or the finance side of things. And lastly, I'll round out a little bit about how we can move beyond carbon. We just received the question if everybody can hear. Could someone just confirm that aside from that one question, everyone else is able to hear? Maybe just pop something in the chat. Audio is good from Stefan.
There's lots of little
Yeah.
hands waving. That's so funny.
All right, so it's hopefully an isolated audio, and we don't have 100 and some people who have just been watching me move my lips with no sound. But very briefly, we'll just do a little bit of housekeeping, and actually that's a good reminder to start recording. Now we started recording from the beginning, so recording has been going on as we've been speaking. So we'll have the 5 talks, will be about 12 minutes, and then 3 minutes dedicated for questions. And then after that, we'll have a bit of a panel session, having a conversation between the different panelists for 15 minutes, and maybe a little bit of an encore time. If anyone wants to stay past the scheduled hour and a half, you can kind of go like one more question and see if you can convince the panelists to stay for a few more answers. We'll then post the recording so people can follow up on this. I know it's a strange time zone if you're joining from Europe. If you are joining from Europe, thanks for clicking past midnight. And then produce a very short sort of mini report summarizing what we talked about today and hopefully putting that into useful context for everyone to follow up afterwards. And lastly, just as a little bit of a plug, this is the first kind of webinar that we've done through the Kelp Forest Alliance, and it's been received really, really well. We've had about 350 people register for this one, which is just outstanding when you think about how many people actually work in kelp forests around the world. It's probably not that many. So we might try to do something similar. So if you like the idea or you want to check out the Kelp Forest Alliance and make suggestions about future topics that we can cover, you can check out our website at thekelpforestalliance.com. And with that, I'll pass it over to Kevin to get us started on the talks for today.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I'm gonna get my slides running here. So, hope you all can see this. So I'm Kevin Wilden, co-founder and co-director of Sustainable Surf, and Sea Trees is one of our programs. And we basically, like, solving climate change, we need a better story on how we do this. And one of the things that are missing in most stories around climate change are things like heroes and role models. So who is the hero of solving climate change? Well, we think it's the ocean. So most of the carbon in the world is 90% of the carbon cycle is in the ocean. So why isn't the world listing the ocean's superpower, which is carbon sequestration, more? That's what blue carbon is about, and in particular, kelp forests. So just to be clear, so Sea Trees is a program of sustainable surf. We're a nonprofit based in California. We're about 12 years old now, and when we launched our company, we were focused on climate change and having surfing become a leader in solutions to climate change. So we launched Sea Trees in 2019, which is a program around restoring and protecting blue carbon ecosystems around the world. We're a nonprofit. We work with other nonprofits. We support their work through grants, through scientific and data collection support if they need it, and through media and storytelling and content capture. Here's a list of our current project maps. So we've got 21 projects that we funded or have funded in the past. And I'm really proud that we're now working with 6 different kelp projects, including the Bay Foundation, Reef Check, Operation Crayweed, Sea Forester, and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So if any of those people are on the call, thank you for being part of our world. And again, it's my honor to support your work. In particular, since we're talking about kelp and carbon, Dr. Jen Smith and a few other scientists at Scripps, we've designed a study, to measure kelp carbon sequestration and all the fluxes of carbon throughout the kelp forests. We're fundraising for it. We're not fully funded yet, but we're starting work. And there's not much to say on this research yet. However, we're planning on holding a scientific workshop in Q1 or Q2 of 2024. And we have a survey, asking scientists what they think their opinions are, which we'll send out after the call today. But let's talk about ecosystem markets. Like this is what it's about. Like, what is an ecosystem market? It's a way to fund the restoration of ecosystems like carbon or biodiversity water, wetlands, forests, endangered species. Like this has been around since around the 1980s. And they're often very ad hoc or very specialized. Carbon is unique in that it's gone global. And biodiversity is growing quite quickly. It's like the hot thing right now. Like last year, I would have said the hottest thing in carbon is kelp carbon credits if they could exist. This year, it's biodiversity credits, ignoring carbon altogether, or recognizing that there's more to the story than just carbon. And so how do we work in these markets? Like that's the name of the game of this, what we're trying to solve here in this talk. How do we understand how these markets work and what are the things we're trying to solve for so they're actually credible and effective? There's also different types of markets. There's voluntary markets, regulated markets, and charitable donations, actually. So regulated markets, government's forcing you to, reduce emissions, and if you don't do it, you're fined. Therefore, you have to do it. And if there's a trade mechanism allowed, then you can actually use that as a way to incentivize reductions. Voluntary is about companies and people just saying, I believe in the solution and I want to be part of it. And by golly, I need a way to buy the credits. Like that's literally how the voluntary market came about. Like in the early 2000s, like companies wanted to participate. They didn't want to have to create their own project from scratch, just wanted to buy the credits. And then charitable, actually, there's a lot of funding going through just charities who do the work and no credit whatsoever. But that's also accomplishing the same goal. So it's important to recognize that is in parallel. But this is sort of the biggest picture possible of what an ecosystem market is. It's like the ecology should not be an economic externality as it is today, right? I'm sure many people on this call have read the famous Costanza et al. Paper showing the value of ecosystem services, and that research continues. And the idea is like the root of what the word ecology and economy are literally comes from the same root word from ancient Greek called ecos, which is the word for home. And it's like the home included both the human household and nature's household as one thing. And ancient peoples have always believed that. It's not a unique thing to the Greeks. It's just somehow we lost that in Western society. And what we're trying to do in this concept is bring these two words back into the meaning of the same thing, fundamentally. So when I talk about ecosystem markets, I really talk about market mechanisms. This is a market mechanism. People lose, it seems like such a big thing and there's all this money and stories about it. It feels like it's much bigger than it actually is, but market mechanisms just serve a purpose in solving the overall environmental problem. And the best example is the Clean Air Act Amendment of 1990, which basically helped solve the acid rain problem in the US from sulfur dioxide emissions from coal plants. And they set up a cap and trade system, and the trade, coal plants were allowed to trade, a reduction they made beyond their actual required bit to coal plants that couldn't get there. And the value was set by the height of the fines if you didn't meet your required reduction in emissions. And that trading mechanism gave an incentive for capitalists to invest in, low sulfur coal technology to benefit from the trading, for those who didn't invest. And it was extraordinarily effective. They solved the problem years earlier than they were supposed to, but at a fraction of the price that was predicted if it had just been government command and control regulations that did it. So, the next thing, 1997, the Kyoto Protocol came about, and it was a global treaty signed by most of the nations on the planet, including the US, to cap emissions from each country. They had a trading mechanism for carbon credits, and had a clean development mechanism for funding, developing countries that hadn't yet had the ability to make a powerful fossil fuel economy, fund the restoration. And that's essentially where carbon credits and cap and trade in carbon started. And just to be clear, the market mechanism in this was always seen as a small part of the overall reduction of emissions. The problem is no country actually reduced their emissions, and now they've passed tipping points in the global climate system to where just reducing emissions is no longer enough, right? We have to actually remove CO2 as fast from the atmosphere as fast as possible. Like with nature-based removals is probably the best way to do it. And which ecosystems are best for that? Well, blue carbon is it, right? So here's some key terminology on carbon credits and really any ecosystem credit. But carbon is the most well-defined, and it's like your unit of measure. So it's a ton of CO2 equivalent, recognizing that there's more greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide and others. That's all rolled up into a ton of CO2. There's a methodology, which is a framework around how reductions of CO2 are measured. There's the baseline, which is sort of in the action of in an example of no action, what are the emissions? And then when you act, what's the difference? That's how you measure the impact, the difference. Permanence is like an arbitrary distinction, choice made by the scientists who, the IPCC in the early 90s, who basically said it's 100 years, pegged to the length of the residence time of CO2 in the atmosphere. But it could have been 25 years, and the residence time of methane, or 500 years is more of a geologic residence time. Leakage is if like, okay, so I stopped logging in this area, it's project boundary, but the loggers just moved to the next forest over, so my reduction of emissions actually didn't occur. So you have to prove you don't have leakage or measure it. Additionality is, would this have happened in the absence of the carbon market funding? So, for example, in the beginning of the voluntary market, people were making carbon credits from energy efficiency, putting in more efficient technology in their factories, and the value of energy was so much higher. They were making money by doing that, but then they sold credits on top of it. They would have done it anyways if the credit was a bonus, so it wasn't, quote, additional. You have to prove that the credit actually makes a difference, right? Registry is a place to track the credits so they can be given a vintage, the year of issue, and to be retired. And retirement is a key point I'm going to come to in a minute, but it means that once the credit is retired, it can never be sold or traded again. Now, methodology is really the core. It distills science into action. It's a specialized science review paper, and you can see an image of the paper Needleman et al. Published 2018, which created Vera's voluntary carbon methodology for tidal wetlands and seagrass. It's VM33. Melissa, who's speaking later, her colleagues wrote that methodology. And it's some key things to understand is that perfect is the enemy of good here. It's not meant to be the perfect summary of how to measure carbon exactly. It's meant to be a way for non-scientists to go in and run a project without having to hire a team of PhDs at every step of the way, to distill the science into a blueprint of action. And it's meant to be, you learn by doing. Projects run. There's an expected failure rate in projects, which helps improve the next iteration of the methodology. And they update every few years. And so it's a process by which a registry actually maintains the methodologies, updates them, the peer review and scientific report, transparency, and so on. That's the process. A couple more quick things. First off, carbon credits are the tail that wags the dog of solving climate change. Like, it's where all the action is right now. And you know what? I wish it started 20 years ago. We wouldn't be in the mess that we're in now. But because reducing emissions is actually so hard to do and has been de-emphasized by the real decision makers, carbon credits is sort of what we need to at least pull CO2 out of the atmosphere to give us time to reverse the tipping points. It's not too late to reverse the tipping points, but it's almost too late, right? So one of the ways we solve that is getting CO2 out of the atmosphere as fast as we possibly can. And that's nature-based removals, right? But let's recognize that it's still about emissions reductions too. It's not just carbon credits. Okay, and then the other thing is that fundamentally all ecosystem credits are charitable. And that means that when something's retired, when a credit is minted and then retired by whoever bought it and retires it, there's no longer any financial value opportunity to be made, period. At that point, whatever money was spent on that credit is charitable. So it really is just a way to fund ecosystem restoration, through whether it's a donation, through a grant to a nonprofit, or through ecosystem credit. It accomplishes the same thing. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with one more slide, which is this is our vision of what a kelp forest methodology could look like. We're calling it Blue Plus. And it's the idea to measure all the carbon benefits of kelp forest. So one is the exported carbon into permanent sequestration pools, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then it's also quantifying the amount of carbon that's living in the forest each year. Because I could argue, especially in California, where we've lost 90% of our kelp in the last 10 years, you could argue that every kelp forest is threatened in California. And unless we actively maintain it, there's divers out there looking for urchin recruitment events and dealing with the urchins that come up before we can eat the kelp forest, or restoring kelp, bringing in new methods to help kelp establish in warmer waters, or maintaining biodiversity by planting abalone or other critters that compete with urchins for the same food. All those maintenance things that we do to make a healthy kelp forest actually have a carbon benefit as well, right? And the idea, of course, is that it combines funding streams. It's not just carbon, it's about everything. Biodiversity, local community funding, fishing and tourism revenue, government support, like all these different aspects of funding to be combined into one system of local communities taking care of their local kelp forests and using every tool in the arsenal and quantifying every benefit possible to make sure that society properly values that kelp forest. Okay, great. So I'm going to stop my talk here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin. We'll have questions for Kevin at the end, but thank you for setting that scene on kelp and the credits and the need for them and their potential applications. And we'll now take a bit of a deep, shallow dive, perhaps, into kelp forest, their ecology, and how much carbon do they cycle. Albert is joining us very early from Western Australia, so we'll set it up kindly for him. Thanks, Albert.
You see the screen, full screen? Perfect. Yes, so I'm just going to talk a bit about the role that the forests play in the carbon cycle and carbon sequestration. So first things first, what is kelp? So kelp is actually a type of brown seaweed, and seaweeds are algae. And seaweeds are often confused with seagrasses, which are actually a very different thing. They actually come from land plants, but both kelp or seaweeds and seagrasses form these coastal habitats that play a role in the carbon cycling and carbon sequestration. So yeah, not all kelps are seaweeds, but not all seaweeds are kelps. As we'll see, the role that these different ecosystems play in the carbon cycle is similar but different. Okay, so seaweeds are truly global habitats. Seaweeds are actually the largest coastal vegetated habitat that we have on the planet. They are found from the poles to the tropics, from the intertidal to hundreds of meters of depth. And kelps and kelp forests actually constitute a big chunk of that. Just to give you an idea, kelp forests occupy an area that is sort of the size of Mongolia and are found around 25 to 30% of the world's habitats, the world's coastline, sorry. So truly massive habitats we're talking about here. And these kelps and kelp forests come in all shapes and sizes. So we have these floating forests, and some of the kelps are actually held by these sort of like trunk-like stipes, and they form a very different type of forest, and then some even creep up into the intertidal as well. Now, these kelp forests fix a lot of carbon, and I guess that the reason why we care about kelps within the seaweed group is just because they have one of the highest fastest growing rates, and so that means that as they grow, they fix a lot of carbon. So seaweeds all up, the latest estimates that we have suggest that fix around 1.3 petagrams of carbon. And just to give you an idea of how much that is, all the forest in Canada fix around 1.2. So really huge amounts. And kelp forests sort of drive most of this carbon fixation. Around 70% of that is due to kelp forests. And as you can see here on the left graph, this amount of carbon fixation is truly gigantic compared to the other coastal vegetated ecosystems, around 4 to 6 times more. Now, the fact that these habitats fix all this carbon, that doesn't mean that all the carbon gets sequestered. So it's really important to understand whether this carbon will be sequestered. It's important to understand what will happen to the carbon that is fixed, right? So what is the effect of that fixed carbon? So for example, here in the case of seagrass meadow, this applies to other coastal vegetated habitats like mangroves, for example. The carbon that is fixed comes from the water, and then ultimately this comes from the atmosphere. However, this is a very important step that we need to understand, and I think Katrina will speak more about that. Yeah, once the carbon is fixed from the water column, it gets simulated, and then a fraction of it will get eventually degraded, right, and then will be converted back to CO2. But it is possible that another fraction of it ends up sort of within the sediments that these seagrass grow in. And so if it's buried fast and deep enough, that will be sequestered, just because essentially it becomes looked away from the atmosphere. So in the case of kelp, we have a similar situation where, again, the CO2 that kelps fix comes from the water column. And so as you know, kelp fix carbon, that creates a deficit of CO2 in the water, and that eventually drives a flux from the atmosphere to replace that deficit, right? So typically, the more carbon that kelps fix, the bigger this flux. So, for example, here, you know, the bigger the kelp forest, the more carbon they'll fix, and the more, or the biggest this flux from the atmosphere will be, right? But the key difference here between kelps and other coastal vegetated habitats is that kelps mostly grow on rocks, right? So this sort of burial step within the same habitat cannot happen. And so we really need to understand, in order to understand how much of this fixed carbon will get sequestered, we really need to understand what is the fate of this carbon. And kelp carbon comes in two ways that you'll hear probably throughout this webinar. It comes in particulate form and in dissolved form. So particulate is this POC, and dissolved is this DOC. So for particulate, think about, you know, actual physical bits of kelp, that is like plates or small fragments of kelp. Whereas for the DOC, which I symbolize here by this molecule, think about this kind of kelp slime. Okay, so let's explore the potential pathways that can lead to some of this carbon that is fixed to end up sequestered. So it is possible that some of this carbon ends up buried in sediments. So that can be, you know, the sediments of seagrass meadows or other vegetated habitats itself, or it can also be unvegetated sediments. And again, if it's buried sort of deep and fast enough, it can remain there for long periods of time. Now, the key question here is how much of kelp carbon ends up buried, and for how long, right? And this is something that we're still very much figuring out. But just to give you a couple of examples here. So for example, in the left-hand side here, we have some work that was done in Australia recently, where I think they sampled around 90 sites, and they found just seaweed in most of the top layer of the sediment, which suggests that, you know, this transport to the sediments does happen. And then on the right-hand side, we're just showing here the amount or the fraction of carbon in the sediment that is derived from brown seaweeds or kelp, which is around 1/3. And in some of these sites, they have found that the sort of the permanence or the amount of time that this has been happening is up to hundreds of years. So I think, you know, in some places this pathway does exist. Another pathway concerns the fate of this dissolved fraction that I was talking about. So as this dissolved organic carbon is exported from these kelp forests, it will be degraded either by the sun, or it will be used by bacteria, and that will turn it back into CO2. However, a fraction of that may avoid degradation throughout its lifetime. So here we're just trying to symbolize little enzymes degrading specific molecules of this DOC component, but then some of it will or can avoid the degradation, and so essentially it will persist in the water column for as well up to hundreds of years of time. So it constitutes another sort of long-term reservoir. Now, one of the things that you can do to approximate how much of this fraction is, you see in a lab with a bunch of bacteria, and then you just leave it for a long period of time, and then after that you can see how much it remains, right? So this graph here just shows, that after a year, around 58% of the kelp was remaining, the kelp DOC, whereas, for example, for the phytoplankton DOC, that was much lower. And then a third potential pathway involves both DOC and POC that is exported to these deep sea areas, where even if that carbon gets degraded and converted back to CO2, that CO2 will take a long time to sort of ventilate back into the atmosphere, just purely because of the fact that these deep water masses take a really long time to circulate back to the atmosphere. Just to give you another example of this part, for example, this is some great work that some colleagues did, where in the right here, this is just simulating kelp particles being released from kelp forests. As you can see, most of the particles sort of get retained within shallow areas, but some do make it across deep areas, and once they do, they just turn green here. Okay, so how much does all these pathways add up to? So I guess the best sort of estimates we have suggest that once you add all these up, just purely by the fact that these are such huge global habitats, this means that these habitats can play an important role in ocean carbon cycling, especially in the coastal carbon cycle, and also in carbon sequestration. However, it's important to realize that these estimates are still really coarse, and that is because estimating carbon sequestration in these kelp ecosystems is very complex, right? And that really speaks to the interdisciplinary needs of this science. To figure out how much carbon gets sequestered, you not only need to understand really well the ecology of kelp forest, the biogeochemistry, but also the oceanography, right? And getting down the oceanography is a big part of this. And so this is a very huge challenge, and that's why it's extremely complex to make these estimates, but it's something that as a scientist is very, very exciting. And the good news is, I guess, that we're slowly making progress towards that, and to the point where we can at least build these frameworks that can help us guide make decisions whether a certain kelp forest or a certain coastline has high or low sequestration potential. I'm not going to go into detail into this figure because it's a bit complex and terrible, but just to highlight that these frameworks exist. And then I'll just end up here with a very important take home as well, which is that just the fact that this habitat sequester carbon, that doesn't mean that they have climate change mitigation, right? What matters for climate change mitigation is that we either increase the amount of carbon that we are removing from the atmosphere, or we are avoiding putting more carbon into the atmosphere, right? And so, the fact that we just try to understand how much as a global habitat this habitats cycle carbon is great, but then the climate change mitigation aspect is a whole another challenge, I guess. And with that, I'll just end up. Okay.
Splendid. Thanks, Albert. That was a very nice run through a very big topic. And if anyone wants to read in more detail, Albert does have a really wonderful review in, biological reviews, which I think is open access. And you could have a deeper read or dive into that. So Colette, you have your hand up real quick. So would you like to have a quick question for Albert? Or is that more of a good job, well done hand? All right, if anyone else has a question, you could raise your hand or place it in the Q&A, and there will be time for this sort of panel-wide discussion at the end as well, if you want a fuller picture. Colette was just saying, well done, good job. Extra kudos. Daryl, you can have our one question for this section if you want to take it. You have to unmute yourself as well, Daryl. Perhaps. Also, just more jobs well done. You can type it in the chat real quick, Daryl, for the Q&A. Otherwise, there will be a chance at the end. Okay, well, in the interest of time, let's move on to Katrina, who, as I understand, is giving us a bit of a sneak peek for a paper that's coming out shortly. So we're privileged to have a behind-the-scenes look at some of her work into how we trace the carbon dioxide removal potential of seaweeds in kelp forests. So thank you very much, Katrina, and please take it away.
Can you see this okay? Yeah. Am I full screen? Okay. So I'm building on what Albert just said and also what Kevin just said. So this is Albert just really clearly introduced some of the problems that we have and the complexity of what we've got to deal with. And he's talked very much about tracking the fate of the seaweed. And I'm going to talk about tracking the fate of the water. The seaweed took the photosynthesized and took the carbon out of. So let me see here. All right, so we're all on the same page with this. We've got to remove an enormous amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but we also have to continue to decarbonize ourselves. And we're talking about carbon dioxide removal. So that's the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And we need to remove a lot, 100 to 900 gigatons from the atmosphere, and that's about 1 billion. 1 gigaton's 1 billion tons of carbon, and seaweeds have been proposed as a biological method of CDR. So I'm just going to start with some definitions, and the key point here, and Albert already mentioned this, is that carbon dioxide removal is a process that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and results in its sequestration. And sequestration is the secure carbon storage of that carbon for over 100 years, preferably longer than that, because we don't want it to come back to the surface in 20 years, for example. And if we want to use seaweeds or anything actually for carbon removal offsets or carbon credits, it's got to go through a monitoring, reporting and verification scheme, which we have some on for the terrestrial systems, not so much for marine systems at the moment. And this MRV is to ensure that the CDR schemes are legitimate, so that they are actually doing what we think they're doing. So they're removing carbon dioxide and securing it. And one of the issues we've got with this seaweed literature, which, to be honest, we're sort of getting over this and moving on to the same page pretty quickly, I think. But the word sequestration has been used quite loosely, and it's been used to all sorts of things have been used as sequestration. So primary production, fixation, and so forth. And what Albert was just talking about is the breakdown products of seaweed, for example, POC and DOC that are stored somewhere. And that's the one Albert's talking about is absolutely critical. But none of these alone are sequestration, because we've got to get the CO2 out of the atmosphere. So just to go back to what we do know. So we know about, I'm talking about air-sea carbon dioxide equilibration. We know in terrestrial plants that carbon dioxide is taken straight out of the atmosphere in a one-step process. So plants, trees take up CO2, half of that's released in respiration, some of it's stored as wood. So that wood, if the tree's over 100 years old, might be considered sequestered, and then it makes soil. And if you know, certainly soil deeper down the soil column is sequestered. It doesn't, that carbon does not come back to the atmosphere for very long periods of time. So seaweeds, it's a different thing because I'm having lobby issues here. Can everyone see that still? Yeah, the lobby things keeps popping up over my slides. So seaweeds take up CO2 in a two-step process, and this is the same for seagrasses and phytoplankton too. So step one is photosynthesis takes up carbon dioxide from the water, and this is a timescale of seconds, just like terrestrial plants, so it's very quick. And this results in this parcel of water in the square box that has got a deficit of carbon dioxide. And in the second step, you've got to have an influx of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the water. Now, the first step's on a timescale of seconds, but the second step is on a timescale of weeks to months in the coastal ocean, and months to well over a year in the open ocean. And the open ocean part is relevant to ocean afforestation, which we're not really discussing today. So just to explain this, the difficulty of measuring carbon dioxide removal for seaweeds and aquatic systems, this equilibration between air and water is very slow. So the reason that you've got this global average of 1 year for carbon dioxide to move from the atmosphere into the ocean is to do with a whole bunch of things, but mainly the partial pressure of carbon dioxide between air and water is very weak. So that's kind of like the concentration gradient. So it's very weak. And the timescales of diffusion from the atmosphere to the ocean are very slow. And when the CO2 is in the ocean, that gradient is very slow to form to draw down the atmospheric carbon dioxide. And CO2 is just an odd gas. It's not like oxygen and nitrogen because it reacts with seawater, and that forms a seawater carbonate system. So carbon dioxide reacts with water, and you have bicarbonate and carbonate ions and so forth. But those series of reactions are also quite slow. They're sluggish. And so the long, that's a synthesis of why these timescales of equilibration between atmosphere and ocean are so slow. So the coastal ocean is faster. You're looking at weeks to months, depending on the system. The open ocean, it's at least a year, on average a year, and the Arctic is actually even slower. So I'm having real issues here, sorry. Can you hang on, I've got it. So how do we assess air-sea equilibration for a seaweed bed or farm? So now we're talking, let's say we're talking a coastal seaweed bed, or we're talking a seaweed farm. So what happens if you follow this scheme through? Here's the first one, A, is just a seaweed bed. And then the carbon dioxide is going to get taken up by the seaweeds as carbon dioxide or bicarbonate. And that's going to result in this grey patch surrounding the seaweed forest, which is seawater with a CO2 deficit. And that seawater is then going to move away, most likely from the, it's very unusual that the seawater would actually stay in that same kelp bed. So it's going to chug away and it's going to move somewhere else. So here it is in this top panel here, E, that seawater has just exited stage right, and it's been replaced by more water that the kelp's going to create a deficit. So you've got to work out, to work out the equilibration, so that's the drawdown of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into water, you kind of got to follow the fate of that seawater. Hang on. There we go. And that seawater might stay in an autotrophic system, right? So it might stay in a kelp bed, move into another kelp bed and stay there for long enough, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, that you get full drawdown from the atmosphere. So you get full equilibration. That seawater might go and run into a heterotrophic system. So it might end up over an oyster bed or a barnacle system, mussel-dominated system. And in that case, that water is going to mix with CO2-rich water that's being respired. And so you kind of have to figure out how much is being drawn down when you've got the drawdown from the seaweed water that's got the deficit, but then it's mixed with this other water. And then in the final scenario I'm going to tell you about is this thing of subduction. So if that CO2, that water with a CO2 deficit ends up going under less dense water, which is quite common, particularly in the open ocean, but also in the coastal ocean, then you never get full re-equilibration. So that it's not, the potential drawdown has not been realized. So I'm just going to explain what that looks like. So here we have, this is a study by Leonard Back, and it kind of explains why this is really important. And it's, in this case, we're using an open ocean system. This is the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt. So this is this sort of massive floating, patchy floating seaweed in the Sargasso Sea. And I appreciate this is not the most user-friendly slide, but I'm going to walk you through it. So this is a modelling study. So if you look at the top panel, all the panels, the red bit is that Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt. And the top panel is the annual mean timescales of CO2 equilibration between the ocean and atmosphere. So if you look at that equilibration time, it's kind of up to a year. It's sort of months up to a year for the CO2 to draw down from the atmosphere as a result of seaweed photosynthesis. Then you have to look at the residence time of the seawater at the surface. It's much lower. So the seawater's going, it's actually subducting. And the take-home message here is in the third slide. The atmospheric CO2 influx is 2.5 to 18 times longer than CO2 deficit seawater is in contact with the atmosphere. And so what happens in this situation is you only get 6 to 33% of the potential CDR. So whilst the seaweeds are taking up lots of CO2, we're not getting full equilibration, and therefore we're only 6 to 30% of the potential. So this is a summary then of what we need to do. So to verify CDR, carbon dioxide removal, so that's monitoring, reporting, verification. We've got these two difficult processes. The one I'm talking about is this extent of air-sea equilibration following photosynthetic uptake. And to do that, you have to follow, it's in a moving body of water, so you've got to follow the water. And that quantifies CO2 drawdown. But then we've got what Albert was just talking about. You've got to verify that the seaweed biomass that was fixed the CO2 is securely stored. So you've got to follow the seaweed, which is exactly what Albert was talking about. So this is what it looks like. You've got these two processes happening. The white process is the one that Albert's talking about. That's following the POC, the DOC. And we know that it does end up in the deep sediments. There's no doubting that. But quantifying it is tricky, particularly from an individual kelp bed. And at the same time, you kind of got to follow that the seawater, because you need to know how much is going to be drawn down. And both are tricky, but as you'll see in a slide coming up, we're further ahead on one of these than others. How do we do this? How do we do the water step? I recommend this paper by Leonard Back for anyone interested in this. It's an excellent, it's an essay, it's very clear. But you kind of have to put sensors in the water, and there's a method called eddy covariance that is what the oceanographers use to do this. So there are techniques available. But as Leonard points out in his paper, it kind of requires an armada of sensors, which is not working. So we will ignore that. So a lot of sensors. Anyway, to summarize, the ultimate control on CDR is air-sea equilibration. And for monitoring, reporting and verification, that's to use seaweeds for carbon removal offsets or credits. You've got to work out how much atmospheric CO2 is removed. That's tracking the parcel of water, the bit I was talking about. And there are methods. There's eddy covariance and there's modelling. And in any of these studies, you've got to hire some physical oceanographers to do this work. And then you've got to work out how much of the carbon dioxide that was removed is securely stored for over 100 years. That's tracking the seaweed carbon. That's what Albert was talking about. And I think we're making good progress on this from Albert and the Wernberg lab and the various teams in Europe as well. So I think that bit's further ahead. And this is the bit that is the next cab off the rank, so to speak. And thanks for that. And any questions, assuming I went within time. No, I'm over. Sorry, I'm over. 1 minute.
You're close. lots of information to digest. So if anyone has a quick question for Katrina, you can just throw it in the chat.
It's kind of
The
hard
microphones
stuff.
are, yeah.
Oh, thank you, Jackie. How do I stop sharing? Oh, here.
There's a little X button at the top there, Katrina.
I've done it. So I don't use Teams ever, as you can tell.
It's institutional preference as you go. Zoom's kind of disappeared from my life. So if there's any quick questions, you can pop them there, or we can keep the wonderful information flow going. Daryl's back. Daryl, just to let you know, you didn't break Teams. The microphones are disabled for everyone. So we'll turn those all on at the end for the discussion. But for now, Daryl asks, how is the diminished capacity of warming oceans to absorb CO2 being incorporated into this work?
It's not yet, to be honest. I'm spending most of my life trying to, really at the moment, we've been trying to explain the fundamentals, and that is a really good point. In my work, it's not yet.
Right, so certainly that will be needed to add to the future as we're committed to some significant warming across our oceans. Would you have a quick one on the cost of monitoring of all this is substantial, and if substantial, degrees of magnitude?
At the moment, yes. It potentially extremely expensive. However, Leonard Back in that paper of his, the 23 one, has got some suggestions on how the global community might actually move forward on this.
All right, thank you, Katrina. We'll pause your questions there, though there's a few more coming through, and we'll move over to Melissa. So if we do have this number for carbon and kelp, how do we actually turn that into a finance mechanism? So please take it away, Melissa.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Yeah, so my name is Melissa. I am going to talk a little bit about the market side, some of which you heard from Kevin and in the previous talks. But yes, assuming we sort all of this out, how do we finance this? And so backing up a little bit, which you've heard from everybody, I think, in the past, but basically acknowledging, and I think particularly given there's been so much flack against carbon markets and the voluntary market and Vera, it's important to recognize, as always, that we understand that cutting emissions is still the priority. But if you look at these plots, we actually also have to employ some level of removals in order to remain below key thresholds. And so what we are discussing is what those approaches are. So, understanding that the gray area must be reduced, but also the green. And those carbon removal approaches are things like engineering approaches. So, for example, ocean alkalinity enhancement, or nature-based solutions. And kelp afforestation, reforestation, restoration, potentially seaweed farming, all qualify as carbon removal approaches and nature-based solutions. And so that is the focal point of this portion of the carbon market. So if you take a close look at the values that some of those engineering solutions might offer and compare them to some of the nature-based solutions, the engineering-based solutions can look quite promising in terms of their impact on atmospheric CO2 concentrations. But if you think more holistically about what we are hoping to accomplish through reducing atmospheric CO2 concentrations, usually those things are benefits for society and resilience for society. Do you want to have ample food availability, prevent community displacement from sea level rise? That truly is our ultimate goal in reducing CO2 emissions. And if you look at what kelp forests provide, they do a lot of those things. They support productive fisheries, they cycle nutrients, they provide opportunities for economic growth, the ecotourism, local industries, aquaculture. They also hold a tremendous cultural significance. And Aaron, who's on this call, published a nice paper this year that tried to quantify the economic impact of just a handful of those ecosystem functions. And we're looking at numbers on the order of, let's say, $500 billion per year just for that subset globally. So we know that they're very valuable. And carbon removal is just one additional a key function on the list of things we already knew that kelps could do. I think probably everybody on this call also agrees that they are ecologically beneficial and they have a certain level of intrinsic value and want to protect and conserve them. But nonetheless, restoration and conservation is expensive and requires financing whether you want it to or not. And so figuring out ways to access new markets and funds to scale up these restoration conservation efforts are going to become more important in the future as we see changes to those ecosystems with changing climates. So, carbon markets, which, as Kevin sort of introduced, came about with reference to cap and trade systems. And now what we're usually talking about in these spaces is the voluntary carbon market. So people who are choosing to offset their emissions, not because they're mandated to, but because they want to. So for example, put very simply, some company, I don't know, Amazon, Salesforce, an airline wants to offset their emissions by choice, and they can pay money to have a project, let's say kelp restoration, done, and they can receive a carbon credit for that project. Then they can either retire that carbon credit and say, I have reduced my carbon footprint by X amount, by this number of credits, or they could sell that credit on the carbon market to somebody else who wanted to reduce their carbon credits. So that is, in its most basic form, how the carbon market should work, the voluntary carbon market, and how it's set up to work. Now that's a sort of simplified version of the carbon market, but in reality it's quite a bit more complicated, and there are tons of different people involved in what this system looks like in order to make sure that it's happening, to a level of rigorousness that we believe is real and verifiable. So it has to be a high integrity market if we want this to work at all. And that means people with different areas of expertise and different parts of the market. So, if the company I mentioned wants to do this, how do they go about finding a project? And there's a whole niche of other companies out there who connect financiers to projects. Then who implements the project? Probably Air France does not have people on staff who know how to do kelp forest restoration. So clearly that's not going to happen. So then there's a whole another layer of project implementation. And if the people are implementing those projects aren't distinctly aware of what the methodologies look like, then they may not be doing it in the right way. So they have to be aware of what the methodologies look like. And somebody has to write those methodologies to make sure that they are rigorous. And then, what you don't want to happen, and what you've seen happen in other parts of the carbon market, is not involving the local beneficiaries. So what about benefit sharing? If the project was not done with and for the communities in which they are meant to be sustained into the future, then there's lower likelihood of success of that project and low buy-in from the community. And you want to avoid, this company making a profit off of sold carbon credits when they've come into some external location and developed a carbon project. And then who says those credits are real? If I wrote on a piece of paper on my desk 1 carbon credit and I gave it to somebody and they were able to sell it, then good for them. And we've just sort of roundabout, got around the entire carbon market. So trying to find ways to establish credibility with verification bodies to ensure that we're not allowing sort of junk carbon credits into the market, which has been improving over the years and is still improving, but is definitely a challenge. So that's kind of a general intro to the carbon market. 1 credit is 1 metric ton of CO2, and the company that I am working with and representing today is Sylvestrum Climate Associates. So just to give you a heads up of where I'm coming from, as Kevin mentioned, we work on those methodologies. So trying to figure out ways to write those methodologies to meet all of those needs. There are methodologies under Verra, which is one of the most established verification bodies, that have seagrasses and tidal wetlands and mangroves, but there is not yet a seaweed carbon methodology that has been established. There's precedent when you look into those other habitats. So the Wetlands Restoration Conservation Project activity was adopted into standard in 2012. The VM33 is the existing Verra code that deals with wetlands. There are other project activities like ARR, RED. Those are things like deforestation, degradation, conservation projects. So mangroves would fall into those categories. And being forward-looking, we are now moving towards developing a seaweed methodology. And we are working on that now. So as you have heard from many of the speakers on this call, the science is still very much unfolding on kelp carbon sequestration. So nonetheless, despite knowing that it's still emerging, you can sort of envision what pools of carbon are leading to sequestration. This is an old figure from a paper that came out in 2016, but very briefly summarizes in blue the types of carbon sequestration that are likely to be more durable. So there's carbon moving in all kinds of different directions, vertically and laterally in the kelp forest. Traditionally, in the existing carbon codes, we would think mostly about this burial in the algal bed. So if it was all super simple, it would pull CO2 straight out of the atmosphere and bury it right immediately in its underlying sediments. And that would be very easy. And you could build into a methodology directives for a project developer, project proponent to go and measure that, because they could go and measure the sediment underneath the seaweed. Unfortunately, for the simplicity of methodologies, the carbon sequestered long term is exported to places like the shelf or the deep sea and below the mixed layer. And so it's a real challenge methodologically to start to include those. And so that is what we are grappling with at the moment. So the key remaining questions are, if and how do we robustly estimate carbon sequestration from those dominant pools? How much research and development is required before default values can be applied? So you can imagine, just if you collected data for 1,000 years on all of this stuff, eventually you would hone in on parameters for a model that could tell you, without measuring, how much carbon was being sequestered by a given project based on the conditions of the project, the size of the project, the species of seaweed. But we do not have any of that information. And so what that means is the early adopters of such a methodology are going to have to do a lot of this work themselves. And so that's not impossible to overcome, but it's a challenge that the sort of process is facing right now. So Kevin also introduced some of these concepts earlier, but just to give you an idea of what we're working on as we're developing these methodologies, which we can use lessons from previous methodologies, but there has to be a clearly defined project boundary, both in the project and in the baseline. So baseline being more like the business as usual. So what you don't want to do is say, okay, I established a kelp forest restoration project and I measured how much carbon it sequestered, where are my credits? You have to say, if I had not measured, if I had not done this restoration, how much carbon would be sequestered? If I have done it, not doing it, you get 2 in that hectare, and doing it, you get 10. So then your credit would be 8. So you actually have to show the baseline and the project in tandem to demonstrate the additionality from your project, and that requires monitoring of both. And it requires also to make sure that you're not saying, oh, well, I sequestered carbon here, but the end result of that actually meant that more emissions were emitted somewhere else. So leakage. So you can't kind of roundabout that way, and it has to be permanent. There cannot be a super high risk such that it's going to be gone in a couple of years. And so all of those things go into these equations that Vera or any verification body that is reliable should be incorporating. Okay, I'm almost done. Within all of this, as we think about how we approach a future where you can use default factors or not have to collect so much data in situ on each project. Sure, there you go. There are considerations like, how close are you to water that will subduct, like we've discussed, or if you're bringing the seaweed to port for consumption or application, maybe in agriculture, are the emissions from that process so high that you're offsetting anything that you're doing from the kelp itself? So all of these things have to be considered and quantified. And then not all species are equal in their productivity. We also don't want to develop a methodology that encourages culture or restoration of species that are non-native. And so there's some policy considerations in there. And where you do that may sort of dictate both the carbon and the feasibility of your study, of your project. And I think lastly, just noting that we are developing the seaweed methodology and had submitted that to Concept to Vera, which is in review right now. But just because there is a methodology available does not mean that the science is complete, right? Development of a methodology means that here are the things you need to know with such certainty in order to achieve a credit. But it doesn't mean that you can get that credit right away using, for example, a default factor. And I think perhaps sometimes that gets misconstrued. Like if there is a methodology available, that means you can have credits by just sort of hitting go. And early on, those early adoption projects are quite a bit more difficult. And also incorporating seascape level approaches, right? So carbon moves laterally across the seascape. And there's some really nice papers to show that although your seagrass meadow may lose carbon, it may accumulate over there in the marsh. And so if you expanded your project area to actually be inclusive of multiple habitats across the seascape, you may be seeing a better picture actually of what's happening carbon wise. And then I think I will just sort of transition away towards Aaron by saying that there are other approaches to financing kelp forest restoration, conservation, and seaweed farming. It is not just carbon credits. There are things like biodiversity credits, bundling of the two to increase the efficacy of a project, mitigation, bonds, like blue bonds initiatives that you've seen in places like Seychelles, and all of those hold promise. So I will end there. I think I probably went over my question time, but
No, brilliant. Thank you, Melissa. So good to have that sort of perspective and market and finance lens to it in addition to the ecology. We have a rogue panelist asking the first question. Albert asks, some kelp forests are highly variable systems in space and time. How do you envision this affecting how we determine those baseline scenarios?
How we determine the baseline. So the baseline scenario will have to be a location. It's an actual location nearby where we are assuming that there is no restoration happening. Now it's confusing because there's such high lateral transport. That is not to say that the kelp from your restoration project couldn't go and deposit itself into the baseline, but you actually have to monitor your baseline. I think in the past you could sort of project, but they're moving towards a dynamic baseline approach where you have to have an actual baseline monitored through time and a restoration project monitored through time.
I suppose quick follow-up on my own curiosity,
yeah.
taking on through the mic. Say the baseline biomass is 10 one year, 12 the next year, 4 the next year, all due to just natural variability and no human influence. How is it as simple as averaging, or what's the approach to dealing with that?
So you would look over time, like you would get a estimate of the carbon sequestered annually, and so you'd sort of presume that the changes in biomass, like you can incorporate all of that variability into how you're estimating whatever carbon is sequestered each year.
Okay, perhaps we can follow that up in this sort of general discussion on how we approach this. I'll carry on. If you could swap to me, or maybe I can just boot you by clicking share screen. Have I booted you successfully? Yeah, easy. Right, so I am sneaking in a talk on the kelp forest carbon credit talk, but not about carbon, more about the biodiversity side of things, which we've all sort of alluded to. And I think the really nice thing, kind of the no-brainer for thinking about biodiversity credits or impacts in these sort of conservation projects, and I say conservation projects as protection or restoration of kelp forests, is it's pretty hard to get the carbon benefit of restoring a kelp forest without also getting some biodiversity benefit that's associated with that. And the biodiversity benefit can be really quite amazing when you think about the vast array of animals and species that live in a kelp forest all around the world. And then when we talk about credits, it's about restoring those species, the habitat that's associated with them. And it's a bit different than, say, offsets. So offsets have been around for quite some period of time, where you say you have a development project that impacts a particular site, and they're legally required to offset that action by restoring habitat in a nearby area. As we talk about biodiversity credits, it's more akin, as we've been discussing, on the carbon side of things, where it's a sort of tradable commodity that can be purchased on the market, and it can be voluntary or mandated for these sorts of different activities. So when we say biodiversity, it's actually, again, quite a general, broad term. It's not as simply defined as carbon, but there's three sorts of approaches that are currently being taken when people talk about biodiversity credits. So that's understanding, what these projects or organizations or activities are impacting, and then what needs to be remediated, restored, or ameliorated, and then how that's credited. So the three approaches that people look at are these sort of more ecosystem approaches, which you can think of like a basket of metrics where there's different elements of the ecosystem, the habitat, the species, different ecosystem functions, and those are sort of tracked and bundled together as a composite. You can look at it from a habitat perspective, which I find a bit of a confusion for particular species of interest. So you're only really tracking that habitat because you care about, say, a giant panda or an endangered salamander or something like that. That's really tightly coupled with that sort of habitat. And so you're tracking that species of particular interest via its habitat, or you can just look at it from a vegetation perspective, for lack of a better word. And that's more thinking about these sort of ecosystem primary species, foundation species, like a kelp forest, for instance. And so for that, you're using the presence of that habitat, say biomass density or percent cover of seagrass, kelp forest, as a sort of proxy for the overall condition of these systems. And so quite recently, there's been a lot of accelerated interest in just the last 2 or 3 years in biodiversity credits and adding that into the carbon perspective and going nature positive and nature-based solutions. And these are all kind of synonymous terms that circle around the idea of improving the health and condition of naturally occurring ecosystems. So some of the big ones are the Task Force on Nature-Based Disclosures. And I bold that one because they're working on having released a lot of the sort of cutting work on creating the frameworks for how to actually measure that impact that I was just talking about. So in the same way that companies have climate footprints to understand how much CO2 they're emitting through their activities, they're now working on creating the same for nature, for biodiversity. So how do the sort of production lines or chains of that company impact nature, and then therefore that establishes how much that organization needs to actually offset or benefit nature to become positive or neutral. Other ones looking at the World Economic Forum, Biodiversity Credit Alliance, IUCN on nature-based solutions, again, very similar term, and then different national and regional standards that are developing around the world. So creating a credit is not so different from the carbon side of things. You need to have the demand for it, so the need to offset an activity or go nature positive with your activities. And that's really core to that understanding, what am I filling the gap? How am I going nature positive? What's my deficit? And that goes back to the Task Force on Nature-Based Disclosures. So that would say the Amazon understands that they have this much impact on terrestrial ecosystems, and therefore they need to restore or preserve this much to go nature neutral or positive if they want to add a positive spin to it. Then once you've understood sort of what that gap that you're trying to fill or that target that you're trying to achieve, you need to identify an eligible remedy or solution or activity. So these are the activities that actually can then contribute to creating the credit. And I'll talk about those in a little bit. You then need to actually do the action and have it succeed, have these sort of quantification systems for monitoring and reporting the outcomes of those actions, have that independent body verify that you have indeed realized those gains, have the credit available, and then have the purchase. So it's not necessarily a simple process. There are a few steps involved, but we do have sort of the understanding of what's required to get there. And the different action types, so this is on, I think it was the third step, are the things that you can actually do to generate the credit, the activities that lead to you being awarded one of these credits. So you can protect a system that would otherwise be negatively impacted, and then maintain that biodiversity that would have been lost otherwise. You can restore a system. So if a system has been lost, if you're actually restoring it, this is the most kind of clear visual aspect. You had something that was depauperate and you restored it to a more biodiverse state. Or you can steward a system, sort of actively managing it to prevent its degradation. And you can think of that, I think, most simply in the context of climate change or invasive species, where your sort of management actions are preventing the loss or decline of that species. Really quickly, from the supply side of things, so when you need to think about how we're actually going to generate these credits, what we need to consider, biodiversity is not like carbon. You know, a ton of carbon in Norway is the same as a ton of carbon in New Zealand for global purposes, whereas a yellow-banded warbler in Norway is different than a red-crested woodpecker in New Zealand. You can't necessarily have that one-for-one exchange or like-for-like exchange of these different units. So that likely, in my mind, means that it's going to be more sort of a regional approach or local-based approach where people are focusing on sort of more their local impacts and their regional ecosystems and biodiversity, because you can't necessarily trade those internationally, though there is still some interest in, say, a company in the UK doing positive work in Brazil and vice versa. Talking a little bit from what Melissa was going on for about the counterfactual is going to be really important in the same way that it is for carbon. So that's just understanding that the activity that you've taken has resulted in the gains that you're claiming. So what would have happened otherwise if you hadn't done that activity? And in biodiversity, that's a step more complicated in that species move, especially in the ocean. So it's hard to attribute all of, say, a certain species of fish to a kelp forest. And you just have to try and think about how you attribute different reliance and dependence on different ecosystems or blends of ecosystems within the ocean. So it might move into more of a, say, seascape type of credit as opposed to a habitat specific credit, because that reflects that it's not necessarily a single habitat that's 100% responsible for the benefit that you're claiming. Similar with carbon, and perhaps even more importantly with biodiversity, the equity and the sort of benefit sharing that's happening from these activities, because, you know, carbon dioxide is an invisible gas and people sort of have a general understanding about it, but biodiversity is really a lot of lived experiences, and people's livelihoods, cultures, and economies often depend on this biodiversity. So if you're going to be having activities that impact it, it's going to be really important that the benefits are shared with those communities and that they're not being boxed out from that system. We talk about permanence in carbon, which, you know, sort of has its arbitrary cutoff line. In biodiversity, it's again a bit more complicated in that different species live for different periods of time, both animals and vegetation. And so how you're going to determine exactly how long you need a habitat to persist, and a dynamic habitat, as Albert's question alluded to, is going to be a really important question as we try to pin down what you're promising when you sell a credit. Is it 20 years of a habitat persisting? Is it 100? Is it 5? These sorts of different things we're going to have some work to do to determine. Really quickly, I'm applying it to kelp. So we think about those different action types. So different activities that are going to negatively impact kelp forest. I think most obviously you have dredging, sort of destroying the kelp forest habitat, harvesting, directly removing it, construction that again modifies or transforms that habitat, potentially point source pollution, so pollution that you can really directly say it has impacted this kelp forest. You can then, you know, tie that activity to that kelp forest in a more concrete fashion. Conversely, if you have more dispersed pollution, say general nutrient pollution, it's a bit harder to directly tie that impact to the kelp forest itself, because it's distributed again across the riverine system, the coastal system, and it's really quite dispersed. And then the same for food web alterations. If you're disturbing the food web, say by removing top predators, it's quite difficult to pin that exactly to a kelp forest as opposed to the ocean or the coastal seascape in general. For remedies, we could do the more traditional approach, creating the marine protected area, and trying to quantify the carry-on effects of that. Pollution remediation, direct restoration is again the sort of most obvious and tangible approach of bringing back a system, or species management, particularly in invasive species. As a very quick horizon scan, we have a map of where laminarian kelp forests exist around the world, and then the current sort of state of play where voluntary biodiversity markets are being established as a mix of private, university, independent, and government-led markets. And Australia actually is one of the leaders in this space and has quite a bit of activity happening in looking at a biodiversity market, or trying to work on a biodiversity market if you're following recent news events. But I think this map will populate quite quickly, as these dots have just been created in the last 2 years, and in the next, say, 2 or 3 years, we'll get a lot more activity for these different markets. Again, noting that they are currently voluntary, and that's probably where the focus will remain on them for the time being, as it will be a ways away before there's a sort of regulated biodiversity market. On the demand side of things, and I'm just going to keep moving quite quickly to keep with time, but the costs associated with these need to be desirable for the companies or organizations or people that are going to purchase them. If it's a one-to-one for how much it costs to restore a kelp habitat, and that's $50,000 per hectare, a company might not view that as a good investment when they can restore some terrestrial habitat for $900 per hectare. Conversely, it could be higher value because people perceive it to be this sort of multifaceted benefit of doing carbon biodiversity and this sort of larger basket of goods that we're talking about. Any sort of legal dimension to it will obviously accelerate the uptake of these credits. As I just said, it's pretty much all voluntary at the moment, but if there's sort of more regulated or demand side legal considerations, then that will run it up. And then desire and perception, really just focusing back on, do these organizations want to be buying these credits? Are they viewing it as good value for them, and ultimately their perception to society, and the perception that the biodiversity credit is achieving what it's meant to achieve? So there's been a lot of negative kind of commentary on carbon credits at the moment in different news outlets, and that's shaken a lot of confidence in it. So as we look to think about developing these, I think we need to step very carefully to ensure that we're perceived to be really achieving the benefits that we say we are, which it's entirely possible. We just don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves in what we're claiming. Looking to the future, the Kunming-Montreal Protocol, or the Convention on Biodiversity, does mandate that countries restore 30% of their degraded habitats by 2030. So there should be quite a large explosion of interest in creating these sorts of biodiversity credits to meet those targets, or be part of the activities that meet those targets. We're actually now seeing the creation of some global funds. So I think the UK and France have recently created a global fund for biodiversity credits to the tune of about £100 million. And then tied back to the protocol, various countries are putting out their individual roadmaps for how they go about establishing these biodiversity credits, or the restoration and protection activities that are needed to generate the credits and potentially meet the requirements of the protocol I just talked about. And lastly, on the broader side of things, there's a big gap in the marine side. So everything that I kind of talked about on that map is really terrestrial focused. And so there's a lot of space to create these sort of activities, standards for activities in the marine realm. As we look to quantify impact with the Kelp Forest Alliance, we are working on creating just a general monitoring and reporting standard for kelp forest ecosystems. So it's not necessarily explicit to creating a carbon credit or a biodiversity credit, but it's how do you measure the important variables and report on them in a standardized fashion for kelp forests. And it does include things that are related to biodiversity or carbon credits, such as fish, invertebrates, fisheries production, carbon growth and cycling, not necessarily capture. But if you're interested on that, you can check out our website or send us an email. And then we have this really wonderful community of practice of different projects around the world that can potentially apply to that and have it taken up. And it's ultimately culminated in this tracking platform that we've developed at the kelpforestalliance.com as part of our larger work to achieve what we've called the Kelp Forest Challenge, which is a global call to protect and restore 4 million hectares of kelp forest. And this is our way of trying to understand how we're tracking in that process and the benefits that are being realized for people doing that. And we'll continue to expand the sorts of metrics that we're talking about here, and start looking at biodiversity, jobs created, and the more social benefits as well. So a whole lot of information, but thank you all very much. And we can start to move into, I think, the general question period, because I've chatted just a wee little bit. So I will take everyone off mute, or I'll just give you the opportunity to ask questions. 1 second. All right, so if you put up your hand, and we'll just call you out, and we can have, but we only have 5 minutes in the regulated time, but I think we've previously agreed that we can stick on a bit later to answer a few more questions if people are available. And yes, the recording for all this will be posted out via an email to all the registered participants.
Aaron, did you want to stop sharing?
No, I love sharing. Thanks. So we have a few. Daryl, yeah, Daryl, take it away. You should be allowed to turn off your mic now. Yeah.
Thank you, Aaron. Excuse me. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, everybody, for the wonderful presentation. This is really for Albert or anybody. But one of the things that Albert brought up was the difference between sequestration and mitigation, with reference to drawing down the levels of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, specifically CO2 in this case. So is there any framework by which resource managers can use, and I know a little bit was answered earlier, but to really establish that so that we don't overvalue some of the restoration efforts, because restoring something may not actually be a mitigation in the long term, maybe relative to the short-term variability, but not in terms of historic norms. And I think that's really important as we begin to look at blue carbon potential around the world, and that we don't oversell some of our work, as important as they are and the additional benefits that they provide, but it may not provide the carbon drawdown that we're proposing that it does. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Maybe I can start. I guess, yeah, as you said correctly, to mitigate, you either need to increase the amount of carbon that you're sequestering. So, for example, if you're restoring kelp forest compared to an ecosystem that was sequestering less carbon, and then or avoid or any diminishing of the natural carbon sequestration capacity. So in both cases, understanding these counterfactual scenarios is very important, and I guess that's where you would have to follow the methodologies as well. So, for example, you need to understand, in order to solve this question, you need to understand how much carbon sequestration is happening in a sea urchin barren, for example, if you're restoring that.
Thank you very much.
Which I suppose goes back to that sort of resourcing that's going to be required to establish these sorts of markets or credits, because it is just a lot of baseline understanding, monitoring, and measuring that we need to do. I had a quick one on the current status of biodiversity credits. They're really quite nascent, so it's mostly scoping work and frameworks, or even scopes for frameworks that are currently being developed. And there's not really effective markets available, to my understanding. Those dots on the map are all quite new, and I don't think you can actually act on most of them at the moment if you did want to purchase a biodiversity credit. But it's a very rapidly developing space, so I think that answer could change in a year, really.
Can I ask a question on biodiversity credits?
So,
like in the old days when I was a student, biodiversity was like the number of species, right? Like per unit area. So you wouldn't necessarily increase the biodiversity of a system, but you're going to expand a diverse system, right? Am I right?
It depends how you metric it. So, like,
Yeah,
as
well,
I was
I
saying,
think that's
it
my
can be-
question. I'm a bit
Yeah.
old-fashioned on that, out of touch.
Yeah.
My
So it's-
understanding, sorry, go ahead, Aaron.
No, go for it, Melissa.
Well, I have reviewed the Plan Vivo's biodiversity credit proposal, and they've had it bundled as this multi-axis of biodiversity. So one for species, so for example, species richness, but also like a habitat complexity, like coral rugosity could also be in there. And also one for something like water quality. And if you hit enough of these metrics, then you could bundle that into some more holistic credit that made it easier to transfer biodiversity credits across systems in a way that is more analogous to carbon. I don't know that anybody will ever strike perfect, but that is the way I have seen it being pitched anyway.
That sounds like a better definition to me.
Yeah, then it's more of like an ecosystem credit at that point.
I think it is.
But the
Yes.
term we
Because
still use is
you know,
biodiversity.
You could argue biodiversity. If you just go in biodiversity, you can just go and chuck as a non-native species into a new habitat and increase its biodiversity, right? And that's, as Melissa said, that's kind of not the goal. It's really about, I think what you just said, Aaron.
Yeah, but because they're all voluntary and a lot of them are actually private company driven, it's entirely as they're defined. So some of the credit could be increasing pure species richness if that's how it's defined, sold, purchased, and understood. It just depends.
That's actually a really key point that Aaron just brought up, which is that it really comes down to how the buyer and seller want to do it. It could be very simple, like through Sea Trees, we actually have a biodiversity credit that we launched, 4 years ago. We launched Sea Trees to call it a sea tree. And it could be like a mangrove tree planted in a mangrove restoration project. That's a mangrove sea tree in our definition. Or a kelp sea tree was a square foot of kelp forest restored. Or a coral sea tree was a kelp coral fragment put on the reef. And our buyers, our donors loved it. And it wasn't highfalutin or too complicated. It was very simple. But in essence, that's a biodiversity credit. And this is the challenge, I think, in the biodiversity market. It's how do we define it in a way that when they're being produced by whoever's producing them and buying them, that it has integrity. And it's, carbon, at least there's this, right? Carbon, at least it's this pretty well-defined thing. It's a fungible thing. A ton of CO2 is the same here in California as it is in Africa, right? Whereas biodiversity is completely different. So this is the challenge. The opportunity is that it's actually a really hot thing. Like, my colleagues was at a conference yesterday in San Jose about biodiversity credits, and all the companies that have been hot on carbon markets, because they care about the climate on this planet, are hot on biodiversity. And so given how hard it is to measure carbon in kelp forests with integrity at this point, perhaps biodiversity credit concepts could bring funding to restoring kelp forests quicker, which is the ultimate goal. I can remember what I said about all ecosystem market credits of any kind ultimately being charitable, right? That's the goal. How do we get money flowing into the restoration? And sometimes you need a framework, a market mechanism to make it happen. And in this case, this biodiversity credit could do it. I think the future is really exciting, but it is very nascent, as Aaron said.
Yeah, and you can't really get the biodiversity without getting the carbon. They're very tightly coupled as a foundation species. Katrina, I might just stop you.
Can I answer the question on biodiversity credit? Sorry, can I answer that eDNA question?
Yes. If you're answering a question or asking a question, take it away.
Can I answer that question? So I think eDNA is another emerging technology. And when I was in France recently, saw some work that was going on in a Norwegian fjord. And the biodiversity at the head of the fjord was massive based on water sampling and sediment sampling, and yet nothing was growing there. So because it was all stuff in the water, it was like propagules and stuff in the sediment. So I think that's another emerging, potentially very powerful tool. But that's going to be a tricky one as well.
Yeah. I mean, that could be even another kind of webinar topic on that. Sort of a lot of hype and
actually that would be a great topic.
Concept. What do we actually do with it? So Marcus has asked about the microbial pump. So is there much research on the relationship between kelp seaweed carbon and the microbial carbon pump? Or degradation essentially through microbes happening. Albert, would you have a answer on that one?
Yeah, I guess there's some great work being done in China, I think, mostly around the kelps in seaweed farms. And then we're starting to do some work as well in our lab, trying to figure out, what exactly is driving this decomposition in the microbial space as well.
Again, I think another great topic is sort of, there's a lot of information floating around on the role of microbes and how we can even potentially harness beneficial microbes in these sorts of processes, but quite emerging. A question I don't really have the answer for, so I'm kind of scared to ask it, but what is the minimum size required for a kelp restoration project to be economically viable for the purposes of a carbon or biodiversity credit? I can just give some quick kind of general numbers from our research. Is, in a very best case scenario, kelp restoration is costing $5,000 to $10,000 per hectare, and like that's the ideal dream scenario that very rarely happens. More average, you're at $40,000 to $50,000 per hectare. And then the value of carbon, based on some of these really loose approximations that we talk about from our study, was $200 to $300 per hectare. So you'd have to have that running for a number of years just to cover the cost of restoration. The biodiversity side of thing is potentially more promising because, as we've kind of just been discussing, it's what people are willing to pay. And you look at these sort of, by a meter of kelp forest things that currently exist or other habitats that currently exist, and the price per unit area on those is a lot higher than the price per unit area for carbon. So that could make that potentially more scalable. The exact kind of point at which it evens out, I'm not 100% sure because I don't think we have enough information to get that sort of diminishing return cost analysis on building this many hectares, but this many hectares makes it not much more efficient. But generally that is the case, like that's the pattern we observe, but I don't have a quantifiable number to say there. Now, if anyone else has bits to add to that.
I think that was a great answer. Nice. I agree.
Well, I'll say this, in the carbon market, direct air capture carbon tons are going for $500 a ton. And I wouldn't hesitate to say that we could probably get a pretty high price for kelp carbon credits if they existed with integrity, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much variability in what people are willing to pay, and at times where these are emerging projects or something that someone's really excited about, the price on carbon isn't necessarily indicative of the market price of carbon. It's more like an R&D investment that makes the price of the carbon look really high. And so it gets a little funny when you get into those spaces. Like I believe Running Tide technically generated credits that were like $150 a ton or something like that, but that's not really indicative of the market. So anyway, it's a little complicated, nor do we have a great sense of exactly how many credits should be generated per hectare still, because of all the things that we've been discussing. And so there's a lot of unknowns, which is why you can speculate, but we definitely don't have a number.
I mean, that's really the key point. Until we can do the science to put a number, we don't really know.
Yeah.
And that has to happen. That's why the science is the next step. More science.
On that note, so on doing the science, Jen, do you have a question for the panel?
Really awesome session. And I appreciate all the way that you guys laid everything out so clearly. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on, given the complexities of measuring where the carbon actually goes that the seaweeds produce, whether it's DOC or POC, and then the complexities that Katerina has very articulately outlined. It just seems nearly impossible for me to think of a methodology that would be cost effective and reliable, given the variability from year to year across space. It just seems like the more I learn, the more I read, the more complex this all seems. And I'm just wondering whether you guys have opinions on whether, you know, coming up with a methodology that we would all feel confident in is a realistic goal. Is it achievable?
I don't know.
I think
Great question.
my view is that we're a long way from that at the moment.
Yeah.
I think, like, at the moment, my feeling is that development of a methodology that identifies any methodology that is proposed must be the most conservative as possible if you don't know. So theoretically, you could see a situation like you've seen Carlos Duarte's preprint that's out. You could credit a seaweed farm and just measure the pool of carbon that's buried immediately below the seaweed farm. And that makes sense to me because you can measure it, you can track it. And that is what has been done in other habitats. So I can see that happening. If we want to start looking into the other pools of carbon that are laterally exported, then it becomes quite a bit trickier. And that is where I'm currently unsure how it is going to go. And but also when you look at the relative magnitude of the importance of those based on in situ, like autochthonous burial, they're much higher. And so that is also where a lot of the value would come from. And so, yeah, I don't know.
And
As perhaps sort of just to go for it, Albert.
Well, I was going to say, I think the key thing here as well will have to be being conservative, right? When you have a lot of uncertainty, you need to make sure that you're using conservative values just to account for all that uncertainty, I think. One of the issues that I see, though, is that, you know, with this, eventually what will have to happen is it's just going to have to be based on modeling, right? However, from the work that we have been doing, I think there's a struggle on how to integrate the uncertainty that you have in your biological system. Then you have another uncertainty in the oceanographic part. So coupling all these uncertainties together in a coherent manner, I think, is going to be challenging. And there's a risk that all these will end up being some sort of like fairy carbon, something that, you know, no one ever sees, but everyone is talking about.
Yeah, and it seems like for any kelp bed, these calculations and models are going to have to be run every year and even season to season, depending on the local environmental conditions, weather, El Nino, heat waves. I mean, yeah, it's complicated for sure, but I appreciate Mrs. thoughts on that. I will make a quick point on, can I just make a quick point on the eDNA question? I just want to make sure we all remember that eDNA is only going to be as good as the data that currently exist. And in the seaweed space, there's, you know, relative to the animal world, very few species have even been sequenced at a very minor level. And so we're not going to get a good handle on biodiversity using eDNA for seaweeds.
I might just add.
I wanted to. Sorry.
One last thought on sort of the original question that I found sort of useful in how I approach this space is, what are the sort of things that need to happen anyway? You know, regardless if we're successful in creating a kelp carbon credit, what are the monitoring and reporting that we need to develop anyway, just for the science, the conservation, the management, and that's maybe then can be applied to the sort of kelp carbon biodiversity credit, but also has other uses. So that's sort of the philosophy that we're working on with our monitoring and reporting framework, because we have a bunch of other needs for it. And if it can be applied in that context, then that's an additional useful need, but we're not necessarily pinning everything on that one end point.
Now, can I say something on that? So we're focusing on the here and now. The globe, everything's changing very quickly. Ocean acidification is another factor, and I've completely lost my train of thought. Sorry,
like adapting
I do this all
for the future conditions,
I get hangry and then I totally lose my train of thought. I actually need to eat for lunch.
Should have sent a snack back.
Let me jump in.
Sorry,
Okay,
I've just remembered. What I'm trying to say is that all this work that's being done is going to help us know and understand what the coastal carbon cycle is going to be like in the future. And you know, because it's all going to change, rates of breakdown are going to change. So a lot of this work, whilst it may or may not end up being carbon credits, it is going to let us work out what our future ocean is going to look like, and I think that's super important.
Absolutely.
And let me just jump in, like, okay, climate change is the biggest existential threat to all things living on planet Earth, and CO2 emissions is what drives that. We have to solve that problem. We have to learn all the different ways Earth has for removing CO2, and if and how humans can enhance and speed those up, right? And kelp is one of those ecosystems, as Albert was saying in his slides. Like, kelp fixes a lot of carbon, and I refuse to give up hope that actually a lot of that carbon gets sequestered, but we don't know. We got to figure it out. And if we can figure it out, then, and it's actually a lot, then maybe there's a lot of additional funding that can go towards it, or maybe not. But the goal of the carbon market is to do that.
Yeah, we know that a proportion of
Yeah.
it's sequestered. I don't think we can argue with that. The difficulty is measuring it.
Yes, exactly. So let's measure. And to be totally clear, like, I've been working in carbon markets since early 2000, like way before almost anybody. And this is one of the hardest methodologies for quantifying carbon that has ever been attempted in traditional carbon markets, easily. Nothing else has been this complicated. But hey, we're here to solve hard problems, are we not? Are we here just to kick back and drink beers and watch Netflix? No, I think we're all here to figure out how we can solve these challenging problems.
I went to a really great workshop in Sydney that was about it was actually about all methods of carbon dioxide removal, like some marine, including ocean and alkalinity enhancement, and some terrestrial. And it seemed to me that, I don't know, Melissa might know this, but in the United States, especially in California, they're making huge progress in like literally using carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as a resource and turning it into stuff like building materials. And that seems scalable and tractable to me, and a lot simpler. So, for me, at the moment, that was one of the most hopeful meetings I've been to, because I'm so fed up with all this doom and gloom we keep getting about climate change. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there. There's other, perhaps more tractable ways of doing things, but that doesn't take away from the fact that kelp forests are tremendously important, like globally, huge importance. All that carbon, it's definitely going somewhere.
Yeah, important not to lose sight. I think we'll have one last question, if anyone has a burning one before we close. Michael, you've got one about seaweed forests, seaweed farming, but maybe you can just follow up with Melissa independently, since we haven't touched on the farming side of things too much. So if anyone has a general question about kelp, carbon markets, biodiversity credits, just wants to say hello, now's your chance. Otherwise, you'll hear from us again with a little bit of a recap. All right, hearing none, I might just take this opportunity to thank our panelists so much for sharing their wealth of knowledge and really presenting what I think has been a very concise dissolution of a very complex topic to everybody today. And thank you everyone for attending. And yeah, hopefully we can maybe do something like this again, because I think it's been a really wonderful conversation and a nice way to just have a chat and see where we are. So thank you all.
Thanks for hosting, Aaron.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. It's great.
Yeah.
Really great fun. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye for now.
Thanks, everybody.